Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. It's a big mistake to think that practicing the Dhamma only applies to when you're sitting in formal meditation. Meditation is a part of the practice and an important part, but it's definitely not the whole of the practice. And it's pretty useless if you only feel bright and peaceful when you're sitting on the cushion. Practicing the Dhamma is something to be applied in all situations at all times. It's a general guideline for living. In the formula of the Eightfold Noble Path, there's a path factor singled out as right livelihood. And if you think about it logically, there isn't really a need for that, because anything you do in terms of livelihood would be covered by right action or right speech. But I think the Buddha included it to emphasize the importance of our actions in the world, what we would call in modern terminology our economic actions, the way in which we support our existence has a special place and has some karmic significance. And any task we undertake, whether it's narrowly defined as livelihood or not, any task we undertake is a opportunity for practice. There's a tradition among the Sufi masters that, at least in some of the Sufi sects, if a student goes to a master to study, he won't teach him anything spiritual until he's mastered a trade. The Sufi master always has some trade, stone carving or carpentry or whatever, that he's the master of as well. And he'll first teach the student that, and he won't teach him anything about the spiritual practice until he's mastered the practical skill. Which shows that in that tradition there's a recognition of the inseparability of action in the world and spiritual practice. Whatever task we undertake, it should be done with wholeheartedness and with attention and with mindfulness and dedication. You know? As you are probably all aware, Khema Ananda, the founder of this place, he was a master carpenter and a cabinet maker. He did some very fine work. And one of his sayings that I heard him say often, in terms of always applied to building or creating something, he would say, beauty is the result of love plus attention to detail. So you love what you're doing, you put your heart into it, You want to do the best possible thing you can, but that's not enough. That by itself, that's the right attitude. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The other half of the formula is attention to detail, which means that anything you make or do or build is composed of many, many small actions. If you're constructing a building, attention to detail is every single nail, is every single blow of the hammer is done with care and attention, so you don't split the wood or bend the nail. And the cumulative result of all these small acts done with attention to detail is then the overall effect is very good. Another thing that Kama used to say about work projects was he would call them karma yoga, because this makes it a practice. Karma means action. So karma yoga is spiritual practice in action. And it also has the double meaning that you're creating meritorious karma by undertaking selfless service. When you do any action that's not for your own personal gain, then you're making merit. And for some kind of psyches and for everybody at some particular time, this can be the most effective spiritual practice. There's the story of Milarepa, the great Tibetan yogi, which is a story that's often cited as an example of the principle of karma yoga, because in his early life he'd made some very serious bad karma. His first teacher was a black magician, and he was practicing black magic, and at one point he destroyed an entire village with a hailstorm because the village had been annoying his master. So his master told him to practice his black arts and destroy the village. And after that, he saw all the destruction and people and animals hurt and killed. He had a change of heart. He felt remorse, and he sought out a Buddhist teacher. And his teacher was Marpa. And Marpa knew, because of his advanced abilities, he knew that this fellow had extremely bad karma. And so at first he wouldn't give him any real teaching, but he put him to hard labor. He had him build a kuti out of stone. He had to drag all the stone blocks up from the river on his back and build this kuti. And then when he was almost finished, Marpa came along and says, "What are you doing? A square kuti? That's no good for a yogi. I want a round one. Tear it all down and start again." And then when he was almost finished that time, Marpa came by again and said, "I've changed my mind. I think I want a pyramid." And he had to tear it all down. And he was doing a fourth one, I think, I forget, maybe it's an octagonal or something. And Milarepa at that point gave up in despair and thought, this fellow's never going to give me the teaching. And he tricked, he got around, sort of played on sympathy and got around not Marpa, but Marpa's wife. And she gave him a ring that she said, "This can show that you're a student of Marpa, and you go to this other teacher and tell him that Marpa sent you, and he'll give you the instructions." And because he did that trickery, it took him a very long time to get any results in his spiritual practice. He had to work very hard, and it took him a very long time. But the original intent of Marpa was to have him purify himself with this labor, with work, as karma yoga. So we can take anything that we find ourselves doing, we can take it in that spirit as this is karma yoga, this is a spiritual practice. And we should apply to any task that we do, we should also apply the 4 iddhipadas. Is the 4 roads to power, or ways of means of success. And these are specifically cited as applying to meditation, samatha meditation, and also to any task, any practical task undertaken in the world. They apply equally as well. The first is viryam. Virya is energy or effort. So put your back into it, make an effort. And the energy comes from effort. The two are, energy underlies effort, and effort produces energy. And you can easily see that it's very often the case that when you begin to do anything, the hardest part is just getting started. Psychologically, the hardest part is getting started. There's an old saying, "Well begun is half done." There's quite a bit of truth to that. Another one of the iddhipadas is chitta. Chitta, as you know, is mind or consciousness, and in this case, it means that your mind or your chitta, your consciousness, is attending to the task at hand. Your mind and your entire being is present with what you're doing. You're not off daydreaming about something else while you're doing the job. That makes it into a meditation in itself, a focused meditation of activity. And it is possible that it does happen that people who are particularly doing some kind of fine, detailed work, that they have brief, momentary jhana-like experiences while they're doing it. The mind becomes so one-pointed, so unified on the task at hand. Chanda, the third factor, is enthusiasm. A literal meaning of chanda is actually desire. And this is something that needs to be pointed out and understood. Again, it's a problem with translation and language. Second Noble Truth is often translated that desire is the cause of suffering, but the word in the Pali for desire in that case is tanha, which is thirst for sense pleasures, for becoming and not becoming. Those 3 are specifically cited. So it's a very particular kind of desire. Whereas chanda is the movement of the mind towards some activity or experience. And it can be spiritually positive if the object is spiritually positive. So there's Dhammachanda, the desire or the enthusiasm for Dhamma. So having this kind of chanda in the mind, enthusiasm, zeal for the project is one of the roads of success. You've probably all heard me cite this before. One of the sayings of Ajahn Pasanno that I found explicitly very useful over the years is, if you can't get out of it, get into it. This means to try and find chanda for, anything you're doing. We all, in our different life circumstances at different times, we all find ourselves having to undertake some task or activity that we don't really relish. We'd rather not be doing. And the best way to approach that is to try and put yourself into it and really take an interest in it and try and rouse that chanda through taking an interest in the activity itself, rather than doing it begrudgingly and half-heartedly or distractedly. You can't get out of it, get into it. And the last one, the fourth iddhipada, is vimamsa, which is investigation, and is essentially similar or very nearly the same as Dhammavicaya, the enlightenment factor Dhammavicaya, investigation of Dhammas. This has a bearing to what I cited earlier, the saying of Khemas, attention to detail. So it's application of intelligent attention, paying close attention to the actions and results, so you can adjust your actions according to the results. And this carries on through any activity. One of the ways in which I recall Khema explaining this principle was planing wood with a hand plane. If you examine the shavings that come out, you can determine if the blade of your plane is set properly. You can see if it's too thick on one side, then you adjust it, and so on. And paying attention to the results of any action lets you adjust going forward. And I think you can see that attention to detail and investigation of the action applies across the board. You can see the difference between someone who has this factor or is activating this factor and someone who's not. The example would be cooking. If you just mechanically follow the instructions in a recipe, that might be suitable the first time you cook a dish to learn it, but then you experiment and play with the proportions or the ingredients, and that's vimamsa. I've also seen this with something like computers. A few times in my life, both before and after ordaining, I found myself in a situation where I was trying to explain or tutor someone in some kind of operation of software, and there are those people that they just want to get a fixed formula. They want a number of steps written down or clearly explained that they can follow through to do this or that. And they never get very far because they're limited to what they have explicit instructions for. And other people become curious about underlying principles and generalities and want to understand what's happening. And then they can expand their knowledge and their skill on their own. They have a basis for it. And that's the absence or presence of vimamsa. So these four Iddhipadas, Virya, Vimamsa, Chitta, and Chanda, are critical for success in any activity undertaken. And one or the other may be stronger, more dominant at any given time, but they should all be present to some degree. And they apply also to meditation. For developing meditation properly, you have to put the energy in, you have to have the enthusiasm for it, you have to be single-minded about it, and you have to adjust your practice intelligently according to results. You know? So right livelihood, getting around back to that path factor, that's whatever action is done according to Dhamma, but particularly in the economic sort of modality. Right livelihood is defined differently for lay people and for bhikkhus. A right livelihood for a layperson is any career activity that's done honestly and righteously without causing exploitation or suffering, and outside of the what are called the five forbidden trades, which are dealing in animals for slaughter, dealing in human slaves, dealing in poisons, weapons, or intoxicants. Those are the five forbidden trades. But outside of that, any job, any career that's taken up can be done righteously. You don't exploit anyone, you don't cheat your customers or your employers, and you do the job wholeheartedly, then it's right livelihood. Bhikkhus, Vinaya, the Buddha laid down, the bhikkhus are actually required to be completely economically dependent on the laity. The word bhikkhu comes from a root meaning a lump of food, and it really means a beggar. So it's a mendicant life, entirely dependent on what is freely given. This is different from some of the Christian monks. I was visiting a Christian monastery once, and I was getting a tour. Me and a couple of other monks were there, we Buddhist monks, and we were given a tour of this place. And they have a workshop where they're making jams and jellies, preserves for sale. That's one of the ways they support the monastery. And they told me that under the rule of Benedict, monks are required to always be useful. And I said, well, it's quite different in the Buddhist rule. We're required to always be useless. We're not supposed to do any action for reward, even for our own sustenance. Which doesn't mean the monks don't work. I've seen the monasteries both in Thailand and overseas, particularly from time to time when there's some projects to be done. Monks can work quite hard in maintaining the monastery and doing building and repairs and so on. But they're not allowed to work for wages or sell their labor in any way. So it's not a injunction against work per se, but just to work for economic return. Sometimes it's thought, I've heard, in the West, people misunderstand the role and the actions of the monks, and they think that the monk's job, so to speak, is teaching, and the monks are paid by the lay people in terms of food and shelter in return for teaching. And that's actually a misunderstanding, and it sort of cheapens the whole endeavor. There's a talk, it's been published, and you can find it on the internet. It's actually quite entertaining, by Robert Thurman, which has been titled, it's not his title, I think somebody tacked it on, Free Lunch Monastery. And he's making the point that basically in the ideal understanding, the monks and the lay people don't really owe each other anything. That the lay people feed the monks just because the monks are hungry and the lay people are generous. And the monks teach just because the lay people are curious and the monks have some knowledge they're able to pass on. And it's a free gift either way. It's not an exchange. And there'll be some monks, maybe many monks, who never really teach in their whole lives as monks. They don't have the aptitude for it, or they don't have a desire or interest in doing so, and they're still valid. They're not negligent in their, as long as they keep the Vinaya rules, is the bottom line of it. Even to say that the bhikkhus are beggars is a bit misleading, because they're not really allowed to beg in the terms of asking for anything. The oldest, most traditional way of getting food for the day is to go on alms round, bindabat, which is still universally done in Buddhist countries, Theravada countries. The monks strap the bowl on their shoulder and they walk through the village slowly. And they just make themselves available if people want to give. They don't ask for anything or knock on doors or actively beg. They just walk through the village and hope that people will feed them. There's one Vinaya rule that's actually in its expansion, and the way it's a fairly lengthy rule. It comes across to the modern understanding as a little bit humorous. It's actually the rule that defines the role of a monastic steward, a layperson who takes care of the material needs of the monastery. And this particular rule explains what the bhikkhu is supposed to do if he suspects the steward has been misappropriating funds or any material goods that have been given to the monastery. He's not supposed to confront the steward or ask for the goods directly, but he can stand silently in front of the steward's dwelling. And the steward asks, "What are you doing here, sir?" He's not supposed to answer until the third time. Then he's only supposed to say, "You should very well know." So there's really a strong emphasis in the bhikkhus not seeking their own material goods. And there's only very limited cases in which a bhikkhu is supposed to directly ask for something. One is if he's ill and he can ask for medicine, if he knows some specific medicine will help. Another one is he may ask relatives, close relatives like siblings or parents. Or he may ask any layperson who's given Bhavarna, which is the layperson says, "If there's anything you would like, sir, just ask." And that's supposed to be considered, if it's not renewed, is considered to expire in 2 months. And when I was taking Vinaya classes in my early career, in Nanishat, this came up talking about Pawarna and how to handle it, and one must, the bhikkhu should use discretion. Like if the layperson says, if there's anything you need, just ask. And you should know what they mean is, do you need razor blades, or do you need a woolly hat or something? But and you say, oh yeah, I'd really like a ticket to Thailand. That's, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to extend beyond what's implied as the offering. There's one more final point about right livelihood that I'd like to bring up, which is more of a meditational and technical aspect. All the 8 path factors have a Lokiya and a Lokuttara level, that is a mundane and supramundane level. And in ordinary practice, day-to-day regular practice, the path factors are Lokiya, they're worldly, and they're to be interpreted literally. But then there's the second level, is the Lokuttara or supramundane level, which in terms of mind moments is defined in the Abhidhamma as the moment before full awakening. There's a series of consciousnesses that occur before full awakening, and the final realization of Nibbana in Abhidhamma terms is like a 2-step thing, Magga and Phala. And sometimes that's used, Maggaphala is used as a synonym for awakening or enlightenment. Maggaphala means path and fruit. And Magga is the last karmically active mind moment, and Phala is a resultant mind moment. And Phala is the actual realization of Nibbana, but is always preceded by Magga, which is the 8 path factors coming together, perfectly realized on the supramundane level, which means that they no longer are applying themselves to worldly things, but to the unconditioned or Nibbana. They're all aligned to Nibbana. So, right thought is thought about Nibbana. And right livelihood, I recall reading this in a talk from Ajahn Lee. He explained this, I thought, very well, that right livelihood in the mundane sense, the Lokiya level of right livelihood, is how you support your body. And it's the actions you undertake in the world to acquire sustenance, nutriment. And in the Lokuttara level, right livelihood is how you feed your mind. And the nutriment of the mind at that Lokuttara level is Nibbana, is the unconditioned. So that's the highest and most refined level of right livelihood. Yeah.